Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Bessesen, who's going to talk to us about regulation of body weight and its relevance to obesity. Dr. Bessesen had his undergraduate training in chemistry in Colorado State University, followed by training in internal medicine, endocrinology, metabolism, and diabetes here at the University of Colorado. He is the director of the Anschutz Health and Wellness Center. And needless to say, he's a well-known authority and an international researcher in the area of obesity, over 25 years of NIH funding and publication in this area. So super excited to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Holger. Thanks for being here today, those online and those here in person, including my friends from endocrinology. Thanks for showing. Again, I'm Dan Bessesen, and I'm going to talk about regulation of body weight as it relates to obesity. For all the clinicians, doesn't matter what field you're in, whether it's hepatology, pulmonary, cardiology, oncology, obesity affects so many of our patients. If you could make obesity go away, I think the health of the country would be dramatically better. I think of obesity as a disorder of body weight regulation, just as diabetes is a disorder of carbohydrate regulation, or hypertension is a disorder of blood pressure regulation. But it really begs the question of what is body weight regulation? Ideally, you'd like to understand the pathophysiology by understanding the normal physiology of what goes wrong. But the challenge is we really don't have a deep understanding of weight regulation. But this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, so I just sort of want to share some of the things that I've been thinking about here. Let's start with a typical person here, a man from age 20 to age 60. You just think about, I mean, we often think that people choose what they eat and they choose how active to be. But if you really do the math, over 40 years, 365 days a year, you eat 2,300 calories a day. That's 33 million calories over your life. That is a lot of food. That's 8,000 pounds of food with some assumptions. And so if you think over the course of that time, I put 8,000 pounds of food into my body. Average person gains a little weight. Maybe if somebody gained from 135 pounds at age 20 to 155 pounds at age 60, that'd be kind of a typical person. That represents a 70,000 investment in new tissue over 40 years. And you just do the math, that's an imbalance of 0.002 or 4.8 calories per day. I mean, that's a little over 1 gram of carbohydrate per day, or about a half a gram of fat per day. So I think it's pretty obvious that the system is regulated, and it's regulated with dramatic precision. I mean, you could just never get a system to be this precise. And so how does that really work? Well, I share this partly for the clinical folks. This is a rat study. This is rat weight over a rat life. And what you can see is a rat in an environment where food's accessible and they don't have much ability to exercise, sounds like our life, rats will gradually gain weight through most of their life. If you take a rat and you put a tube in its stomach and you overfeed it, you can get that rat to gain weight. But as soon as you stop the overfeeding, the rat's weight goes back not to where it was, but to where it would have been. Isn't that crazy? And if you put this rat on a diet and it loses weight, and then you stop the diet and just let the physiology run, again, the weight goes back not to where it was, but to where it would have been. So that's my understanding of how weight is regulated. It's not a set point. It's not stable. It's a developmental trajectory. Now, some folks, because of their genetics, the environment they're in, they're prone to a more steep trajectory and they can get into health problems. Other people, whether it's because of the foods they eat or the environment they're in or their genetics, are less prone to weight gain. I must say a lot of clinicians are in this obesity resistant group, and so they see their patients who gain weight and they think, well, if you just eat less and exercise more, then you could weigh what I weigh. I guess I would flip that around because I think this is a biologically regulated system. If you're one of these fortunate obesity resistant people, what if I told you you needed to gain 100 pounds and keep that weight there for the rest of your life? Because it's the flip side. If people overeat, there are adaptive responses that prevent further weight gain. Your energy expenditure goes up, you're not hungry anymore, changes to physical activity. So it would be as challenging for Dr. Drasnin to weigh 300 pounds as it is for somebody who weighs 300 pounds to weigh what Dr. Drasnin does. This is a regulated system, and so I think we could look at it from both sides. Well, how do we understand this regulatory system? What I said is food, the imbalance is only a few calories per day. So maybe food intake is closely regulated. This is just an old study, 20 people, where they weighed and measured how much food they ate over 7 days. And what you can see is day-to-day dramatic variations in food intake. Some people are eating twice as much on some days as they do on other days. And most of us eat 30 or 40% different calories day to day. So how do we get this dramatic precision when there's all this randomness in our food intake? If you look day to day, again, there's almost no correlation. If I overeat today, I don't adjust my calories the next day, hardly at all. When you get out to 3 to 5 days, you start to see some regulation. So what this suggests is this regulatory system, which is incredibly precise. It works over some time frame like 3 to 5 days. So how does that work? Well, so our brain must be doing something. It must be measuring the energy value of what we eat. It must be measuring the energy expenditure that we're doing, and it must be assessing the stored fuel. But we don't eat energy. We eat macronutrients, fat, protein, and carbohydrate. And that's where most of our calories come from. So the task for the brain is not to measure energy, but to measure nutrients. It has to measure literally how much fat did I eat, because it has to balance how much fat I burn each day. If I'm in positive fat balance, meaning I eat more fat today than I burn, then I have to put it somewhere. It goes into my body somewhere. Where does it go? It goes into these stored fuel pools, which vary dramatically in size. There is no real protein pool that's just there to be there. Proteins in our body are used to do things. Glucose, there's maybe 200-300 grams of glucose stored in the body as glycogen in various tissues. That lasts you a day or two. So it's a small pool size. And the daily flux, the carbohydrate that goes through that pool size, is pretty big compared to the pool size. Compared to fat, fat is uniquely difficult to get energy balance because it's energy dense, meaning there's not that much of it for a lot of calories. That's energy intake. And we burn it each day, but it goes into this pool size. I'm about 24% fat. That's kilograms of fat. So how do I measure, 80, 90 grams of fat going through the system each day? So maintaining fat balance is a particular challenge to the body. And it's not just energy balance, it's more complicated. If you think across the day, if there's some regulated parameter of energy balance, I wake up in the morning and I'm kind of in negative energy balance because I haven't had anything to eat all night. Then I eat something and I become a little more positive energy balance, but then I don't eat before lunch. I eat at lunch, I'm assimilating nutrients, I'm becoming more in a positive energy state. Then I exercise in the afternoon and I'm more in a negative energy state. I'm mobilizing stored nutrients. And then I eat dinner. And I'm probably at the highest positive energy state I'm going to be over the day. So, and even hour to hour, when I eat breakfast, an hour later, my intestine's in positive energy balance, but those nutrients haven't reached my liver or my muscle. So just imagine what the brain has to do to make such an accurate system when this is the sort of data it gets. I won't say too much about it, but I think we used to think about meal regulation. That clearly is not what's happening, but there's a diurnal variation here. So in some sense, you could look at nutrient intake as, 12 hours of nutrient intake, 12 hours of fasting, that delivers this kind of rhythmic signal around which some regulated parameter is established. Well, how are we going to study this thing? We've been doing this for a long time. I'll just share with you the most recent data we have. It was really fun to do this talk because we got some brand new data we hadn't even looked at. And our group said, oh, Dan's got to talk. Let's just see where we're at with the most recent data. So that's mostly what I'm going to show you, some recent data from our study. But just as a brief bit of background, we've studied animals, we've studied humans with different propensities for weight gain. So some people are naturally thin. How does that work? That seems like a good regulatory system. Some people are already obese. Some people have lost weight, and I'll show you more data about that. Some people come from families where obesity is a problem. We've studied those people, animals and humans who are prone to obesity, and humans who are resistant to obesity. Because we're interested in regulation, we've tended to study people in states of short-term energy imbalance. We overfeed people. Now, if it's a regulatory system, it should respond to that. So if we want to understand the system, how do these different types of people and animal respond to overfeeding, exercise, underfeeding, physical inactivity? So these are the parameters that we've used over the years to look at this. And what we've tried to understand is what are the adaptive responses? If it's a regulated system and then you stress it, how does it respond? Does it respond in energy expenditure changes or appetite changes? Where are the nutrients going? Because where the nutrients are, that's the signal to the brain about energy balance. So that's the general theme of what we've done. I spent 10 years of my life doing this study. We looked at thin people and said, if you overfeed them, what's that about? Because that seems like a good regulatory system. And do those physiologic responses to overfeeding then predict subsequent weight gain. So just to briefly summarize this, I think for a lot of us, we think of thin people and say, oh, they must have a high metabolic rate. Or maybe if they overeat, they just burn off those calories. We found no evidence for any of that. In fact, people who were obesity prone, their energy expenditure went up actually a little bit more than the thin people when they overate. So no evidence for that. What we did find is that thin people had greater reductions in their appetite following overfeeding, and it correlated with changes in a number of gut hormones, in particular this intestinal satiety hormone, PYY. So that implied that energy expenditure, yet plays a role, but appetite probably is more important in the regulation of body weight in responding to overfeeding signals. We also found that metabolism was different in that thin people had greater fat oxidation, but it happened while they were sleeping. And that was not a hypothesis we had. It's just something that we saw, which again highlights this diurnal variation. We know that shortened sleep time is not good for people, that it's associated with obesity and diabetes. But what we don't know is what happens while you're sleeping that's so important for giving the brain an accurate signal about energy balance. Well, anyway, that was our previous study. So from that, we're doing this study. And shout out to my team. They do great work here. This is a study we call Adaptive Responses to Overfeeding and Weight. And what we're trying to do here is to look at the effects of short-term overfeeding on a whole range of things: nutrient metabolism, energy intake, energy expenditure, physical activity. And again, we're selecting these different groups. We have 3 groups. We have a weight-reduced group who are exercising, and a group that's just diet alone, compared to a control group with obesity. And the idea here is we're trying to determine whether exercise training is protective. What does exercise do in a reduced person that helps them to not regain weight? There's a lot of data that suggests exercise is not necessarily a great way to lose weight, but that if you lose weight, if you exercise, you're less likely to regain weight. Now, the simple idea is you're exercising, you're burning more calories. So we'll be able to look at that. I've always thought that's probably not the right idea. But we're looking at short-term overfeeding, 3 days in these 3 different groups. And we're going to correlate the results of the responses to this short-term overfeeding with longitudinal weight gain. So if somebody increases their energy expenditure with overfeeding, are they less likely to regain weight? If they reduce their appetite more, are they less likely to regain weight? So really phenotyping them in the reduced state. So here's briefly designed. We have 25 obese controls. We have 50 people that are randomized, 25 to diet alone, 25 to diet plus a supervised exercise program to give them 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise. So they go through some training. That's a level of exercise that has been shown to protect against weight regain. They lose 8 to 10% of their body weight, these folks do, so now they're in a reduced state. And now we stabilize their weight for 3 weeks, and we just measure a bunch of stuff about their metabolism, hormones, nutrients, physical activity, and then we'll follow them over time to see what happens. Again, there's a ton of data here. This is actually, last week was the first time we saw some of this data, so I'm excited about this. I don't know if you'll be excited about that. What do we do during this intense 10-day study period? These are the days. And we have this run-in period where we really rigorously control their sleep, because again, we think sleep is probably important in this process. We control their diet and do a 3-day run-in diet, and then we put them in the indirect calorimeter here at University Hospital, where we can measure nutrient oxidation. We draw their blood every hour through much of the day. We measure hormone excursions. We measure lipolysis rates at night. And then we discharge them, and they've either been overfed or eucaloric. And then we just see what they do. How much do they eat? How much do they move around? How do they respond? Just letting their own biology do what it does following this period of either overfeeding or controlled eucaloric feeding. And then we'll follow them over time. So I'm just going to show you some of the recent data here. This is their energy intake in these different groups. That's what we'll be looking at, our control group of people with obesity, people who lost weight 8 to 10% with the diet alone, people who lost weight with diet plus exercise. And so here's their energy intakes. You lose weight, you eat less, and you got to keep eating less forever. But but then we overfeed them 40%. So this just shows that we in fact overfed people. What happened to their energy expenditure when we overfed them? Here are control people with obesity. I must say, at our thin people, same thing. You overfeed people, their energy expenditure goes up. So that's what you'd expect. If I overfeed you, how would you try to maintain your weight? You'd burn off the extra calories. So there's a modest increase in energy expenditure. We overfed them by 500-600 calories. Their energy expenditure goes up 150-200 calories. So it doesn't come close to compensating for how much we overfed them. Look at our reduced people. Their energy expenditure is lower. And so their energy expenditure is lower, so they have to eat less. And when they overfeed, our diet alone group increments a little bit. Interestingly, our exercise people didn't increment at all. So to me, what this says is that following weight loss, energy expenditure does not go up with overfeeding. So again, how would a person who's lost weight not gain weight? They overeat, they burn off the calories. Doesn't happen. So this is an adaptive response that promotes weight regain, the loss of the adaptive response to overfeeding. And exercise doesn't help this. So again, we're trying to understand, why does exercise help people lose weight? It's not by protecting their energy expenditure during overfeeding. The result is people who overfeed, who are just obese, yes, they're in positive energy balance by about 250 kilocalories over those 3 days. People who've lost weight by diet or exercise are in greater positive energy balance, whether expressed by kilocalories or percent energy expenditure. And there's no difference between the diet group and the diet plus exercise group. So somebody who's lost weight is prone to regain weight because they are more prone to positive energy balance, and exercise doesn't help that. Oh, I think that's what I just said there. How about nutrient oxidation? I'm going to show you carbohydrate, fat, and protein. This is the carbohydrate panel. This is how much we fed people. We fed them a mixed diet. We didn't feed them a high-fat diet. We just took their usual food and upped it by 40% of the calories. So here's again our control group, our diet reduced group, our diet plus exercise group. So we overfed them carbohydrate. What happened to their oxidation? Remember, carbohydrate, there isn't much of a place to put it. So you overwhelm the body with carbohydrate, the body has to sort of oxidize it. This is kind of the only choice. In the hierarchy of nutrient oxidation, protein is probably number one, well, alcohol is number one, and then protein and then carbohydrate. So here are control subjects, overfed, they burn the carbohydrate. Diet-induced people increase their carbohydrate oxidation. Their exercise people were more metabolically flexible. They responded to the overfeeding more in terms of the oxidation of carbohydrate. But there's total energy expenditure, some of it's carbs, some of it's fat. So the mirror image is what happens to fat. So they're overfed, so their fat intake goes up. Remember, if you're in positive fat balance, you're going to gain fat back. What happened to their fat oxidation? Fat oxidation goes down with overfeeding. Why? Because you have to burn the carb because you don't have a place to store it, so you store the fat. Interestingly, the people who were exercising, again, they had this sort of flexibility. They're able to, they burn more carb and burn less fat. They responded to the overfeeding with greater metabolic changes. Yes, but they lowered their fat oxidation. Isn't that bad? Here's their protein intake. And again, protein balance is really important to the body, so not big differences there. So what does this result in? It results in overfeeding, you have positive nutrient balance. Remember that first figure, energy in, energy out, carb in, carb out. So when these folks overfeed, what happens? They're in positive carbohydrate balance. The control group was in less positive carbohydrate balance because they could increase their energy expenditure more. These groups did not increase their energy expenditure as much, so they're in greater carbohydrate balance. How about fat balance? These groups are in greater positive fat balance than the control group. Exercise maybe helps it a tiny bit, but it's a pretty small effect. Protein balance is pretty similar between all of these groups. So the conclusion here is that with weight loss, people are predisposed to a positive fat balance, which would tend to lead to weight regain. And exercise might mitigate this a bit, but it's not a huge effect. So how about appetite? So I think what we can see is energy expenditure is not the way that exercise works. Metabolism might be, and again, there's more data in here that I didn't share with you. Some things about nocturnal lipolysis and nocturnal fatty acids. So I think metabolism is changing in a way that exercise is favoring fat oxidation, which is part of the picture here. But here's appetite. This is an old study that Mark Cornier did a long time ago. We took some of our thin people, naturally thin people, and some reduced obese people, and we overfed them for 3 days. And our thin people, as soon as we started to overfeed them, this is hunger, self-reported hunger. You give them a visual analog scale, say, how hungry? I'm super hungry, I'm not very hungry. People give you a mark. And you ask them before breakfast, how hungry are you? How about before lunch, before dinner? So hunger drops quickly in thin people with overfeeding. Their brain is getting information about how much they're eating, and their hunger goes down. Our reduced obese people, it's nothing. It's like their brain does not see the excess calories, and they don't self-report change in hunger. Mark did some functional brain imaging of these people, and we show them in the MRI, show them pictures of good food. And if they're fasting, you show a picture of good food, and their brain sort of lights up here like a Christmas tree. Palatable food is a strong signal to the brain. Your brain knows what to do in the picture of a chocolate cake or piece of pizza. Now you overfeed that thin person. Remember, overfeed them, their self-reported hunger goes down. What happens to their brain? It all goes away. So you show them that picture that was a strong brain stimulus before it no longer is. How about people who are reduced obese? Overfeed them, do their brain, and what does it look like? Lights up like a Christmas tree. So the person who's reduced obese and is prone to weight gain does not seem to sense nutrient in the same way that a thin person does. So this implies that appetite is the more predominant mechanism that predisposes to weight regain. When a person who's lost weight goes off the wagon for a day, overeats, their brain doesn't seem to recognize it and doesn't shut down appetite. Here's our more recent study here. These are hunger ratings. How hungry are you across our 10-day study, breakfast, lunch, and dinner on those 10 days of study in a eukcaloric condition and an overfed condition. Here's our control subjects. And really these hunger scales are pretty much between 55 and 70 most of the time. Those people who are on diet plus exercise actually are more in this 50 to 60 range. So they are self-reporting less hunger than our controls and less than our diet. So exercise seems to, in these folks, seems to be associated with less hunger on both the eukcaloric and the overfed state. Again, this is consistent with the idea, why should exercise be useful in preventing weight regain? Changes hunger. This is prospective food consumption. How much could you eat? Here again, our control groups are in this 50 to 70 range. Our diet alone, 55 to 70. But our diet plus exercise, more in this 50 to 60 range. So appetite seems to be different in people who are exercising in a consistent way. Exercise seems to reduce hunger, seems to reduce interest in food over time. This might be how it works. Why does this happen? Here's some hormones that are relevant to appetite. This is leptin levels, again, in our control group, in our diet plus exercise group, and our diet alone group. And what you can see, our control group has leptin levels. Leptin is made by adipose tissue. It's a satiety hormone. Now, if that's true, maybe you could just give leptin as a treatment. That seems to not work because people who are obese seem to have leptin resistance. Leptin is produced in proportion to fat mass, but it also has this weird diurnal variation. It's not pulsatile like or something, but it's not flat either. It has a rise at night. So our control group's leptin levels are in this 100 range. People on diet alone are in this 60 to 70 range, and diet plus exercise maybe in the 50 to 60 range. So again, leptin varies between these groups. More leptin would give you more satiety. This is the fat telling the brain what to do, and it's lower. So if people who exercise have more satiety, and it was from leptin, the leptin should be higher. So this implies that adipose tissue may not be the primary signal. Here, and so weight loss reduces leptin levels. Exercise may lower them even further, which is a little counterintuitive to the idea that they're not eating. This is just one of the many hormones we measure. This is PYY. This is a intestinally derived satiety hormone. Here's our control group, and this is kind of in this 130 to 170 range. Again, it's a satiety hormone, so the lower it is, probably the more hungry you are. And it's lower in both the diet group and the exercise group. But this exercise group is appears to be more responsive to overfeeding. Remember, our people who don't gain weight respond to overfeeding. Their body senses it. So this, to me, implies that weight loss reduces PYY levels, which might make people more hungry. But exercise might make them more responsive to the diet. So in summary, maybe the most important message I'd give you is weight is regulated. So this is not a personal choice that people make to be obese or overweight. They have a disease of body weight regulation. And so I think understanding weight regulation is important. There are a comprehensive range of adaptive responses to energy imbalance that promote weight stability. They involve appetite, energy expenditure, where nutrients are, and hormones. And while changes in energy expenditure are important, I think changes in appetite are probably more important than weight regulation. And I think right now that exercise alters nutrient sensing in a way that makes the appetite more responsive to energy imbalance. The way I'm thinking about this currently, if you think about this regulatory system, I think the brain's at the center of it. And there are these homeostatic eating centers in the brain that live in different places. And they get input from a variety of nutrient sources. I must say, I used to think fat was really important, but I'm thinking it's less important. Muscle and liver are important, but I actually think that much of this sensing occurs in the GI tract, and that something about GI nutrient content, which is present over days, not hours, generates hormone signals that are maybe the most important. And the success of compounds like GLP-1 agonists, GIP agonists, glucagon, I think really emphasize this idea that the GI tract and its nutrient sensing play a really important role in overall body weight regulation. Other things that are important, food has rewarding qualities, and there's other regulation of rewarding pathways. Prefrontal cortex fights with striatum. Social cognitive factors are important. People have feelings about their weight, and people can have motivation to try to override these regulatory systems. Mood's clearly important in this, but I draw these circles as smaller because I think this is really where the weight of the regulation occurs. I think reward plays an important role, and actually what happens is probably when we're out of balance energetically, the rewarding qualities of food change. This is the gain that turns up the desirability of food when you want to eat, when your body wants you to eat more, turns down the rewarding qualities when we want to be in more negative energy balance. I think these things play important roles, but I think they're just not as strong as this is. Thanks for letting me chat. These are the people who did all the work on this, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
That's a great talk. I learned a lot. You know, a lot of people say that when they start exercising, they become they have more hunger. So is there a, so does it take some time for exercise to affect appetite?
Yeah, and Mark has been doing some interesting stuff with this. He's done more functional brain imaging stuff. It's really hard to design these studies. Exactly what kind of exercise? Is it resistance or aerobic? What level of intensity? What duration? Are you trained? Are you not trained? The response to exercise is complicated. Right after exercise, most people are anorectic. They don't want to eat right then. So how does time of day and alignment of timing of exercise with food intake, how does that work? So I think it's really complicated. Again, if you exercise, you're burning calories, it would be normal to get hungry. Yeah, but are you hungry enough to compensate for the calories you burned? So that's ultimately the body weight regulation question. Not am I more hungry, but am I hungry enough that it changes my intake to equal or offset the exercise calories expended? Yeah.
Then you ad-lib feed all these people after initial investigation, is that right?
Yeah.
And so the time may play a role in the results that you determine later. So if you, I don't know how quickly after that initial 10 days of hospitalization you measured all that, but if you wait 3 months and they ad-lib diet, and then you remeasure all the hormones and all the energy expenditure and appetite, would that become all the same after that, or not? Or they retain the differences that you've shown?
Yeah, I mean, it's so I think intake's important. I think the response to this period of overfeeding, for example, is really important. Should we measure it in the days afterward, or weeks, or months? The problem is there's so much noise. I mean, if you let people ad lib and feed, their intake is all over the place, and the errors we're talking about are so small they're almost unmeasurable. But in our previous study with the thin people, what we found is overfeed them for 4 days, and then see what they eat over the next couple of days. And there was a difference between our obesity-prone people and our thin people on the second day after they overfed. Our thin people ate less on that day. And it wasn't huge. It didn't make up for all the overfeeding, but it was a difference between the two groups. So again, I think, and so that window is close enough to the intervention that I think we see a signal. But we do look downstream at using doubly labeled water to really show us more total energy balance. Doubly labeled water plus body composition tells you energy balance. So it will tell us something about intake over that next year, over long periods of time.
And whether over the year, that difference of second day will just be
Washed out.
Washed out completely.
Yeah.
Or if you overfeed them longer, 3-4 months of overfeeding, would that change their responses?
And other people have done those longer term overfeeding studies. Again, we pick 3-4 days because I think that's the time frame that the regulatory system, you don't have to overfeed for 3 months to get a response. You get a response in 3 days. I mean, you can see this. All the hormones change, the nutrients change quickly.
Oh, sure, but I'm talking about the length of those changes.
How long do they
Sustained
stay
there.
Yeah.
And whether you can bring your guys and overfeed them once a month for 3 days.
Yes.
And
These studies take a long time. Fine.
So Dan, you were talking about this complexity of the type of exercise, the timing of exercise, what time of day you do it. 2 questions. One is, how did you design that in your study? And then the second question, based on everything you've learned, how do you counsel your patients?
So the dose of exercise was based on epidemiology that 300 minutes a week seems to be a dose threshold and moderate intensity. So we don't tell them when to do it. That's our dose, is 300 minutes per week is what we shoot for. As far as how I use this with my patients, I guess I must say the biggest thing I use this with my patients is that weight is regulated and that there are adaptive responses and that appetite's a key one. That exercise is important, but probably what it does is changes the gain on your appetite. That's the kind of stuff I say to people. It emphasizes the importance of dietary self-monitoring and paying attention to diet quality and composition and stuff. I should let us go. We're over time. Thank you for your attention, everybody.